Economic philosophy did not emerge from quiet libraries or abstract curiosity. It emerged from upheaval inequality and the urgent need to explain why wealth flowed as it did and why suffering persisted even as societies claimed to progress. When I trace the lineage from Adam Smith to Karl Marx, I do not see a polite debate between thinkers separated by footnotes and centuries. I see a long argument about power morality and human nature carried out across factories, markets, revolutions, and ruined lives. These philosophers were not simply describing economies. They were diagnosing civilizations at moments of stress, each trying to explain what held society together and what was slowly tearing it apart. Adam Smith stands at the beginning of modern economic thought, not because he celebrated greed, as he is often caricatured, but because he lived at the threshold of a world transforming itself through commerce. Writing in the late 18th century, Smith observed a Britain where markets were expanding, guilds were weakening, and traditional hierarchies were eroding. In The Wealth of Nations, he argued that prosperity did not arise primarily from hoarded gold or state privilege, but from productivity, specialization, and exchange. The famous invisible hand was not a hymn to selfishness. It was an observation that individuals pursuing their own improvement within a framework of law and moral norms could unintentionally advance the public good. Smith assumed a moral economy beneath the market shaped by sympathy, fairness, and restraint ideas he explored more deeply in the theory of moral sentiments. Markets, in his view, were powerful but fragile, requiring trust and justice to function. Smith's world, however, was still one where capitalism felt dynamic rather than dominant. Small producers, merchants, and landowners coexisted in uneasy balance. As industrialization accelerated in the early 19th century, that balance shattered and new thinkers emerged to grapple with consequences Smith could sense but not fully foresee. David Ricardo, writing in the shadow of war and industrial expansion, stripped economics of much of its moral language and reduced it to distributional conflict. His theory of rent revealed that landowners could extract wealth not through productivity, but through scarcity, while workers were pushed toward subsistence wages by population pressure. Ricardo's cold logic exposed a disturbing implication. Growth alone did not guarantee shared prosperity. Someone always captured more, and someone else absorbed the cost. Thomas Malthus pushed this anxiety further. Observing poverty amid rising output, he argued that population growth would always outpace food supply, condemning much of humanity to perpetual hardship. His pessimism horrified reformers, but resonated with elites who feared disorder. Malthus transformed poverty from a social failure into a natural law, a move that justified inaction and discipline. History would later judge him partially wrong in prediction, but profoundly influential in framing debates about welfare responsibility and moral hazard. Already, economic philosophy was becoming a battleground over whether suffering was inevitable or constructed. As factories multiplied and cities swelled with laborers, the abstract debates of classical economics collided with lived reality. Workers experienced long hours, unsafe conditions, and wages barely sufficient to survive. Wealth accumulated visibly at the top, while insecurity deepened below. It was in this environment that Karl Marx emerged not as an academic observer, but as a revolutionary critic, shaped by exile censorship and industrial misery. Marx accepted much of classical economics' analytical framework, particularly labor, as the source of value, but he inverted its conclusions. Where Smith saw coordination, Marx saw exploitation. Where Ricardo saw distribution, Marx saw class struggle. Marx's central insight was that capitalism was not merely an economic system, but a social relation. By separating workers from ownership of the means of production, capitalism compelled them to sell their labor to survive. Profit, in Marx's view, did not arise from clever exchange, but from surplus value extracted from labor unpaid and hidden within wages. This was not a moral accusation alone, it was a structural claim. Capitalism, he argued, contained internal contradictions that would intensify over time: concentration of wealth, periodic crises, and alienation of workers from their own activity. History in Marx's framework was not a series of accidents, but a progression driven by material conflict. What makes Marx so enduring is not that his predictions unfolded exactly as he imagined, but that his questions refused to disappear. Why does productivity rise while insecurity persists? Why does growth coexist with poverty? Why do crises recur despite innovation? Marx forced economic thought to confront power directly, to acknowledge that markets distribute not only goods, but control. He rejected the idea that capitalism was a neutral mechanism, insisting instead that it reflected specific historical interests destined to change. Between Smith and Marx lies a transformation in how economies were understood. Smith believed markets could harmonize interests under proper institutions. Marx believed markets institutionalized conflict that could not be reformed away. One trusted gradual improvement, the other anticipated rupture. Yet history complicates this opposition. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw capitalism adapt through regulation unions and welfare states, mitigating some of Marx's darkest outcomes without abolishing markets. At the same time, unregulated capitalism repeatedly produced crises that echoed Marx's warnings, from depressions to financial collapses. What unites these thinkers is often overlooked. Both Smith and Marx were moral philosophers before they were economists. Both worried about dignity, social cohesion, and the corrosive effects of unchecked power. Smith feared monopolies and state capture. Marx feared commodification of human life. Their disagreement was not over whether economics shaped society, but over whether the system they observed could evolve without tearing itself apart. Each wrote not for eternity, but for a moment of transition. As the 19th century closed, economic philosophy fractured into schools attempting to escape this binary. Marginalists shifted focus from labor to individual preference. Neoclassical economists abstracted away class and history in favor of equilibrium models. These frameworks delivered precision and policy tools, but at the cost of memory. The human conflicts that animated Smith and Marx were buried beneath equations, only to resurface violently whenever crisis exposed what theory had chosen to ignore. And it is here at the point where economic philosophy shifts from grand moral narratives to technical management that the argument between Adam Smith and Karl Marx refuses to end. Because every time markets expand, inequality widens, or crises erupt, societies find themselves returning to the same fundamental questions about freedom, fairness, and power. And the long conversation that began in the age of factories continues into the modern world, where finance technology and global markets amplify old tensions in new forms, and the legacy of these thinkers still shapes how we argue about capitalism itself. As the story turns toward disappeared, only changing vocabulary, as each new era attempted to tame the same underlying tensions. After Marx, economic thought did not resolve the conflict between markets and morality, it learned to manage it. The late 19th and 20th centuries produced economists who sought stability rather than verdicts. John Maynard Keynes emerged from the wreckage of the Great Depression not as a revolutionary, but as a pragmatist shaped by failure. Where Smith trusted self-correction and Marx anticipated collapse, Keynes focused on fragility. He argued that capitalism could survive only if the state intervened to stabilize demand, smooth cycles, and prevent mass unemployment. Markets, in his view, were not evil, but psychologically unstable, driven by expectations and fear. Left alone, they could destroy themselves. Keynes did not reject Smith's insights or Marx's warnings. He absorbed them selectively. He accepted Smith's belief in productive markets, but rejected the idea that they naturally equilibrate. He acknowledged Marx's diagnosis of crisis, but rejected inevitability of revolution. His philosophy transformed economics into crisis management, embedding government as a permanent actor. For much of the 20th century, this synthesis held. Welfare states expanded. Inequality narrowed. Growth felt legitimate. It appeared briefly that the long argument might be settled. Yet history refused closure. By the late 20th century, inflation, stagnation, and fiscal strain revived skepticism toward state intervention. Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman resurrected Smith's suspicion of concentrated power, arguing that planning, even benevolent, erodes freedom and distorts knowledge. Markets, they claimed, were information systems too complex for centralized control. This was not a return to naive laissez-faire, but a reassertion of limits. Once again, economic philosophy swung like a pendulum, not because truth changed, but because circumstances did. What makes the lineage from Smith to Marx enduring is that it frames economics as a moral struggle over agency. Smith asked how individuals could pursue improvement without tearing society apart. Marx asked how societies could tolerate systems that systematically dispossess. Keynes asked how instability could be managed without destroying freedom. Hayek asked how freedom could survive management itself. Each philosopher spoke to a different failure of the same system, and each remains relevant, because those failures recur. In the modern world, the argument continues under new names. Debates about inequality, globalization, automation, and financial power replay old questions in contemporary form. Is wealth the reward for productivity or position? Are markets neutral or structured? Is intervention protection or control? These are not technical disputes. They are philosophical ones inherited from Smith and Marx alike. The language has changed. The tension has not. History teaches us that economic philosophy advances not by replacing old thinkers, but by reinterpreting them under pressure. Smith is rediscovered whenever markets feel constrained. Marx is rediscovered whenever inequality feels intolerable. Keynes returns in crisis. Hayek returns in recovery. None are final. Each is cyclical, like the systems they sought to explain. To understand Adam Smith and Karl Marx, then, is not to choose sides, but to recognize that capitalism has always required both justification and critique to evolve. Markets without moral grounding drift toward extraction. Critique without productive mechanisms drifts toward stagnation. The health of an economic system depends not on silencing one voice, but on keeping the argument alive. If this journey through the great economic philosophers has deepened your understanding of today's debates, I invite you to subscribe and continue exploring these financial histories with me, and to leave a comment sharing which thinker you believe speaks most clearly to our current moment, because history shows that economic ideas never truly die. They wait patiently for the conditions that make them feel urgent again, and the argument that began in the age of factories will continue as long as societies must decide how wealth, power, and dignity are to be shared.